Welcome, everyone. Hello, and welcome to session D. We're calling this Detroit's Gothic Consciousness. On behalf of the symposium organizers, I'm so happy you could join us this morning. A few things before we get started. First, we do have a symposium code of conduct that is available in our print program. It urges you to use participants' preferred names, nicknames, and/or pronouns while in symposium spaces and to keep conversations respectful. If you have any questions or concerns that arise during the symposium, please find one of our volunteers or organizers. We're all wearing stickers that identify us. Please be aware that all of our sessions are being recorded and may be posted on our website after the symposium. While we have tried to build in plenty of breaks, we understand that if any of our symposium participants need to step away during one of our sessions, they may do so. While we don't have a dedicated quiet room, the library has a reflection room, which is room 2318 in the southeast corner of the second floor. The nearest restrooms are located next to the Delnet area and also next to the tech bunker here on the second floor. Vending machines are located on the first floor of the library behind Bernath Auditorium beneath us. We encourage all participants to use hashtag Gothic Practice 2026 when posting about the symposium today. And as this symposium is focused at least in part on creative critical work, we invite all participants to engage with material both critically and creatively. We encourage artistic and other creations, as well as creative note-taking during all of our sessions. Now, it is my pleasure to reintroduce Dr. Chera, Toni Cunningham, Abby Wilson, and Jess Risk. My name is Micah Spiece.
Yes, and welcome to this session, which was born out of my class last fall. But very quickly before I talk about that, I wanted everyone to kind of introduce themselves. So I think we'll start with Abby and work our way.
Okay. Hi, I'm Abby Wilson. I'm a first-year master's student here at Wayne. And I'm interested in, I'm more on like the creative side of the creative critical.
Hi, Jess Risk. I'm going into my third year. I had to look at him for confirmation. It's all a blur. Of the PhD program here, I study British literature and culture. Specifically, my interest lies in the Gothic.
Hi, everyone. My name is Micah Spiece. It is also going into my third year in the program. We just finished coursework and getting ready for QE, the qualifying exams. I am a literature student with a focus in horror films.
Hi, I'm Toni Cunningham. I am a PhD candidate out of the communications department. I also study film, mostly horror films, and specifically I study Black Final Girls.
And I am Chera. I'm a professor of film and media studies here in the English department. My main area of focus is horror, specifically zombies, but also haunting. And with that, I'm going to pull up. I can do this. I can pull up. There it is, present. But then it's also, okay. Oh, technology. We love you. There we go. Share. So I can share our screen. There we go. Oh, yay. Okay. And I will make that big. So yes, this is Detroit's Gothic Consciousness with these fine people who were all students in my class. So last year, last fall in particular, I taught an upper level undergraduate and graduate course called This Course is Haunted, the Gothic Horror and Haunting Across Media. And the idea behind this course was to explore the role of haunting in media, especially as it manifests in Gothic and horror texts. But besides this, I wanted to take advantage of the city in which Wayne exists. It's the only urban research university in Michigan. And so I wanted my students to be able to research supposedly haunted locations in Detroit to explore the relationship between these hauntings and official histories of the city. So basically, I wanted my students to be able to take the things we were learning in class and apply them directly to the city in which a lot of us live, work, and play. So since this course was on the Gothic and haunting, and since Gothic in any form is, as we've talked about throughout these last 2 days, about the role that history plays in our contemporary lives, having students delve into Detroit's history seems like perfect. It was a great fit. So I designed the course with the understanding that many ghost stories, especially those tied to very popular locations throughout the city, are probably going to gloss over or eliminate difficult histories, the peoples that don't fit tidy narratives of the city, anything that city boosters are trying to sell might get swept under the rug, so to speak. And so I was really curious as to what my students would find in the class, and if any of the ghost stories would tackle some of the more difficult histories of Detroit. Or again, if they would ignore them and kind of present a more sanitized version of the city. And now I change pages. So the places that my students researched are all sites that have been around since at least the early 20th century, if not earlier. They included the main branch of the Detroit Public Library, which is practically on the Wayne State campus. You just walk across the street. It opened its doors in 1921. The David J. Whitney House, which was commissioned by the popular lumber baron and completed in 1894. The Majestic Theater, which opened in 1915. The Masonic Temple, which we heard about yesterday, the world's largest Masonic temple, which opened in 1926. The Leland Hotel, which opened in 1927. Elmwood Cemetery, which we also heard about yesterday, Detroit's oldest non-denominational cemetery, which was built in 1841. Historic Fort Wayne, which sits on the city's south side on the river and was first opened in 1849. And finally, the site of the Benny Evangelista axe murders, which happened in July of 1929. And so in terms of the class, how I wanted to scaffold assignments so that I hoped students could build their knowledge over the semester, while kind of I was hoping that kind of building knowledge would inspire creativity, about, kind of what they were doing. So the assignments included researching the histories of their site, when it was built, by whom, for what purpose, styles of architecture, even kind of what materials were used, who has owned it over the years, research about the supposed hauntings. Some of these were very straightforward and some of them conflicted wildly. Research into historic newspapers and stories about the site, not necessarily about the haunting, but just how has the site been presented historically, especially, in the 20th and maybe even into the 19th centuries. Also, short assignment on like contemporary thoughts on the site, going to blogs, just exploring online and seeing what people are saying about the site or how the site presents itself online. I had all of my students visit their locations and take photos and write kind of a journal piece on their feelings at the site. And then reflections on how the site fit into Detroit. So like, for instance, Elmwood Cemetery used to be on the edges of Detroit and has since become enveloped by the city. Some of these places are far south, some of them are right near campus. Where does it exist within the city? How does it operate within the city? And then one on the physicality of the site. We talked a little bit about a popular idea called stone tape theory, the idea that like high emotions or certain events can kind of record themselves in a location. Would this be possible in your location? Do the materials support it? Is it made of marble? Is it made of brick? Is it made of wood? Is it still standing, in fact? Which became a thing for a few students. And then finally, who are the people and groups associated with this place? Was it built for certain people? Who are the people that frequented it historically? Who are the people that frequent it now? Does anyone frequent it now? One of the things I didn't see coming was that my students were actually, beyond these assignments, inspired to seek research beyond this. So we had people interviewing workers at locations, interviewing psychics in some. We had one student who conducted her own kind of seance at the site using dowsing rods. And they really went above and beyond, kind of filling gaps, because what we noticed quite quickly was not only did the ghost stories have gaps, but the official histories also did as well. So they really took these assignments and ran with them. And you're going to hear some of that in just a second. But I just wanted to say that it was illuminating and exciting to see their work. They went in so many different directions and did so many interesting things. that it really excited me in my own research. And so I'm really pleased to get to hear some of their work today, because it's just it makes me very happy as an educator, but also just as a fellow scholar sitting next to them, to kind of see what they've done with this. So I'm now going to turn it over, before you hear about the projects, to one student to talk about an idea that kind of came through the class and how it's going to structure what we're talking about today.
Perfect. Would you slip the slide? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Gothic consciousness. First, I'll just give a little bit of a background, and then I'll kind of bring it into how we are practicing it here in Detroit. As anyone who has been here for all of these presentations, I think we have all seen really fascinating unpacking and exploration of the Gothic, and also a lot of through lines across all presentations. So some of the things I will say are going to echo some of the presentations that we've already seen, but I have to first say that I think that Gothic is such a fascinating word and such an interesting concept because it does conjure a variety of associations. So as Karen Smith demonstrated yesterday, really fantastically, it can be a fashion aesthetic or, Gothic rock bands like Susie and the Banshees, or, we can think of it in more classical traditions like the architecture and, of course, Gothic literature. But first, I think that Gothic consciousness is something that is really interesting to think about. And this is actually going to echo something that one of our earlier presenters, John, said, mentioning that Gothic, I was like taking notes as he's speaking, because I'm like, yes, exactly. Gothic as a way of thinking. So in this sense, I think that it can really become a way for communities to kind of construct stories about the past, better understand, better navigate, and even cope with the past. So one scholar who I really love his work, his name is Sean Silver, and he refers to a practice called Gothic historiography. And he points to this emerging around the 18th century as a sort of means for interpreting and even sometimes reconstructing historical records in a way that sort of best suit contemporary political frameworks. So if you go to the next slide, just so folks can see this, Silver notes in its original application, the Gothic referred to a partly misremembered, partly manufactured, yet still historically potent myth of origins. And I think that this is a common through line, whether we're talking about it in an English or American or wherever context, that we all kind of share in common with the Gothic. So from its early theoretical conceptions, it was sort of a mode of conscience that was aimed to stabilize the present. And this could be sometimes selectively imagining the past, as Dr. Key pointed to earlier, some things kind of getting left out of the narrative, some of the stickier or more violent points. In the English context, Silver points to this kind of emerging following the English Civil War. So one common thread is that the Gothic framing is not just historical, but also ideological. And so it can be a way for us to kind of grapple with the tensions between past and present. One thing that Andy said earlier that really stuck out with me is that some things you don't have to get beyond or get over. I think I got his exact words because I thought it was such a well said way of thinking about it. And sometimes that is what Gothic consciousness is acknowledging, those things that we don't have to get over, but are sometimes left out of narratives. So yeah, in that sense, it can also kind of function as like a counter mode or, a way of challenging the more dominant historical narratives. Another thing to reference one of our earlier presenters that also really ties into some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in all of our presentations was that John talked about communities establishing national identity via conversation. I thought that was really interesting. And he specifically mentioned, sort of as opposed to archival documents, which I flagged because I did the Detroit Public Library for mine, which is really centered on archival knowledge. So this tradition exists. We can go to the next slide. I'm sorry. So specifically in Detroit, we all spent an entire semester looking at all of our different hauntings. And so I am suggesting that haunting is not limited to just the folklore or the supernatural, but it operates more on as like a social and historical condition. So producing histories that are, as much constructed as they are recovered, in that sense. Gothic becomes sort of intertwined with this like strategy of historical interpretation. So our ghosts, I argue, are not just supernatural specters, but manifestations of things such as unresolved colonial violence or structural inequality. They can be things that, our ghosts linger here to ask us to bear witness to these sort of lingering effects. And the way that they still carry into our, contemporary society. So to understand Gothic consciousness in Detroit, haunting must be understood not just as an aberration, but as an inheritance. And that inheritance can expose, our haunted history and how it shapes our present. If we can go to our, yep, I guess I'm a little behind. Sorry, one more, thank you. So as we all share our experiences with our haunting explorations and our haunted research, I invite everyone to consider what Lauren P. Banks said, which is that ghost stories are not just entertainment, they're maps. They show where a culture keeps its grief. And I thought that quote was really fitting to sort of the exploration that I think a lot of us are going to explore in the coming presentations.
Okay, right. I think we're starting with this one.
Yeah, I was like, that's me. Hi, guys. So we're gonna jump right into the gruesome a little bit. There was a axe murder back in 1929 that is, as of today, still unsolved here in Detroit. It's typically considered one of Detroit's most infamous crime stories. A house on 3587 St. Aubin Street, which is right near the Eastern Market area, is where Benny Evangelist immigrated from Italy with his family and lived in that home. In the 1920s, that area was considered to be Little Italy, and it was home to many of the Southern Italian immigrants. So he and his four children and his wife lived in one of very similar homes that were around at that time during vernacular style homes known as folk Victorian. These were built cheaply because there were so many people immigrating to that area that they were trying to find ways to continue to build homes that were still workable for everybody that was coming in and building up that area in Eastern Market. And it allowed them to populate the space more in order to keep up with the growth. Though Benny worked in real estate, he was also known as a spiritualist. So he often practiced tarot readings and psychic readings in his basement, which is where his altar was. He was considered to be a religious fanatic by a lot of people around, and he also wrote his own, what they call his own Bible, which was called the oldest history of the world, discovered by occult science in Detroit, Michigan. And throughout his time, there was a lot of spiritualist and anti-spiritualist kind of debate happening in the late 20s. So you had people like Benny who were working with people who had lost their family and friends and trying to contact them from beyond the grave. And then you also had a lot of people that believed that people that practice spiritualism were frauds. And so this kind of created a little bit more of a friction during that time when it came to spiritualism. And so when you consider Benny's identity, and his positionality along with the neighborhood that they lived in, a few interesting things feed into that mystery of the crime. So first, Eastern Market was also overrun by mob activity at the time, often credited to racketeering in a ring called the Black Hand. So rival organizations were killing each other on the streets of the area, causing a lot of death to its Italian immigrants. And secondly, as I mentioned, spiritualism was kind of falling out of popularity. I just realized I'm not asking you at all to switch through.
It's easy to forget.
I know.
So there's Benny.
That's Benny.
That's
That's his altar. He had a lot of paper mache type figures that he created and hung from the ceiling in his altar. These are pictures from the crime scene. And there are a lot of, sorry,
Yeah.
so I think I said all of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So next read, a lot of newspaper articles. As I said, this is an unsolved mystery, and for years beyond the mystery, they were still trying to figure out what had happened exactly. And so there's a lot to look at and a lot to read when you're going through historical newspaper articles. And one of the things that, can you go to the next one? Again, Little Italy. They presented it as a happy space. However, when you're looking through all of the other articles, it was also showed as a place with a lot of crime. So there was this kind of back and forth between what that area actually consisted of. And the next one. So now on to Benny's identities. Thinking between the spiritualism aspect of things and then also the Italian immigrant aspect of things, and just the location where he lived, these identifiers kind of put him in a place that provided a little bit more danger to him, a little bit more violence. And so that tension was super prevalent during the time that he and his family were murdered. And there was a lot of people wondering, well, was it because of the spiritualism and the war on spiritualists, or was it because of his identifier as an Italian immigrant, and then the Black Hand also having issues with spiritualism as well? So when the police arrived, they found Benny sitting straight up at the desk in his basement. His head had been chopped off and was on the floor next to him. And upstairs, they found his wife and children, who had also been hacked to death with an axe. Because this murder has gone unsolved, and the site of the murder still exists. However, the house was torn down ages ago. The thought that people have oftentimes, or the story that's told oftentimes, is that if you go to that site at night, you might see a headless spirit walking around, or you may hear disembodied screams. And for decades that those had been the stories. As I was doing research for this particular class, I went to the site visit, and to my surprise, there was an energy company that had set up like a holding space for all of their trucks and their cars. And I thought that was extremely interesting, because when you're thinking of spiritualism, one of the main things that the spiritualists would use to try to connect to the other side are different sources of energy. So if this is the haunted site, if Benny and his family are there haunting the space, they just got an upgrade as far as like how they connect with people around them. So that was something that I thought was very interesting. And then lastly, that you'll hear a little bit more from Jess, but eventually my research led me to the Detroit Public Library. So in 1927, 2 years before Benny passed away, he signed and donated an original copy of his book, The Oldest History of the World Discovered by Occult Science in Detroit, to the Detroit Public Library. It's still there in the Burton Historical Collection, and it's considered to be a haunted book, a haunted article, or cursed, I guess, more than haunted. And it still sits there today across the street. So if you have interest in being around a cursed object, that might be a place where you could find one. And yeah, that's essentially what I've got on Benny. Oh, and I will say, I am also, as Abby said, a creative as well as a critical, and I'm a filmmaker. That's how I make my money outside of school. And so I did make a very short film about this murder from the point of view of the family dog. The family dog survived, was the only survivor of the murders, and ran away the night of and came back the next morning as the police were there trying to figure out what had happened. So in case anybody is interested in a 4-minute super experiential film, there's the link.
Okay.
All right. So I did the Detroit Public Library, which is right on campus. We walked over there for our haunted walking tour yesterday, anyone who was there for that. So this was built between 1915 and, as Dr. Key mentioned earlier, opened in 1921. As the population of Detroit was rapidly growing, so too did its book collection. And so we had a need for more space. It was designed by architect Cass Gilbert in the Italian Renaissance Revival style, and this is white Vermont marble here. It was also partially funded by a very generous donation from Andrew Carnegie. So in my project, I'm really interested in how the Gothic appears in the library, not so much as like a ruin or spectacle, although it has a myriad of hauntings and fun things that I'll tell you all about in just a moment. But I'm also interested in it as a civic institution that organizes memory and community identity. Even I think that it could be argued that the building itself participates in this sort of Gothic tradition of this like mythologized past, because it's really essentially borrowing its style from elsewhere. So in a lot of ways, this library can stand as sort of a monument to both civic and intellectual progress, while also representing, you know, some of our haunted pasts, as it does contain the Burton Historical Collection, which is a very large collection that essentially details Detroit's history. So Clarence Monroe Burton was a prominent Detroit attorney. Thank you. And also an amateur historiographer. He was an interesting person and made a huge collection of documents such as books, maps, local records, newspapers, photographs, etc. And then he actually, in 1914, before the structure was even open, donated his collection to the library. If you want to, yeah, thank you. So this is just not all, but some of the Burton Historical Collection. As you can see, it is quite large, and it actually is housed currently in its own separate wing of the library. So this is also an important site for our haunted research in that there are some ominous happenings here. One is the alleged sighting of an ominous figure, a very famous figure to Detroit, the Nain Rouge. This was,
Absolutely.
it's okay.
There we go. I'm gonna go back.
Oh, there we go. Okay, yeah, thank you. Perfect. There he is. Yep. So this is our Nain Rouge story, which took place allegedly in the temperature controlled vault of the archive. So in an interview, one of the former employees named Alejandro Amalia reported seeing a small figure resembling the Nain Rouge. So anyone who's not from Detroit and not familiar, this figure goes back to our early days in Detroit, and citing this little figure was said to portend misfortune, loss, doom, really, for a lot of Detroit's earliest settlers and founders. So we had a very unlucky employee. At least I would feel unlucky if I saw the Nain Rouge, supposedly seeing this figure in the Burton Historical Collection. Also within the Burton Historical Collection, we've got a lot going on here. Yes, as Toni has already mentioned, I won't get into a lot of the information about Bene Evangelista because Toni did a fantastic job. But as she mentioned, he wrote this book, The Oldest History of the World, discovered by occult science in Detroit, Michigan. And he donated a signed copy of this book to the library. It is said to be cursed. So I think one thing that's really interesting about his book is that he claimed that he was given access to divine knowledge that sadly for the rest of us, we just didn't have access to. But fortunately for us, he did put it in a book so that we could all revisit his wonderful forbidden knowledge. So there's a rumor that the book is cursed. We have an audience member who was brave enough to go in there and hold it in her very hands. I myself did not have your courage. So I think in some ways this can kind of demonstrate how Gothic consciousness can exist not just in ghosts but also in forms of knowledge, especially that like trickier, stickier knowledge that resists sort of classification and even verification, which most of our stories do. Another colorful story, yes, here we are, in the Detroit Public Library is an alleged portal to hell. And this is said to exist in the basement or on the B level. So a reference librarian shared a story that there was a longtime clerk who worked at the library who also was a self-proclaimed witch who had mentioned that there was a portal to hell in the B level, on the B level of the library, and they were tasked with making sure nothing nefarious got either in or out of this portal. I think symbolically we could kind of like see this as a site of liminality, as we have like the archives sort of connecting us to the more violent aspects of our past that are maybe a little bit lost in the narrative sometimes. We also have ghosts in the DPL. I didn't put it in my slide, but there is a ghost cat. But I'm going to focus more on, there are numerous reports of strange happenings in the stacks. So it could be, you know, there are stories of footsteps in the stacks, knocking sounds, things falling off shelves, that weird, creepy feeling like someone's behind you and you turn and no one's there. However, one of the more popular and more frequently cited stories is the story of a little girl with a bow in her hair who is said to be wandering around asking for her doll before she vanishes. Lauren P. Banks, who I mentioned earlier, talks about how ghost stories are not neutral and how they reflect kind of what we choose to mourn. I think this is an interesting exemplification of that because it is a more Victorian sort of safe haunting in a sense. And so I think also like when we kind of contrast this with the name Bruges, I think we can see how, you know, these memories and these hauntings can, you know, on one hand, portend doom, and on the other, almost evoke a sense of loss and sympathy because it's just a child searching for a doll. I'm going to go to the next slide. One thing that I observed, and this isn't a haunting, but it's something that I just wanted to share, in addition to its local lore and its archival functions, one thing that I think is really interesting about the DPL is that it also functions as a sanctuary. It's a place that's open to all, and to a very diverse community, from researchers and students like us, to people who are quite literally seeking warmth, safety, access to information, access to technology. So in this sense, as much as it's a site of scholarship, it's also a site of refuge, which I think is a really interesting aspect of the role that the library plays in our community. I think it also kind of reveals this tension between like the ideological mission of, you know, we have knowledge is power above the door, and it's a library built for all, contrasting with the sort of structural inequalities that necessitate that protection and refuge in the first place. So yeah, I kind of view the library as both an archive of the past and a sanctuary in the present, and also a really interesting character in our Detroit identity, our Detroit Gothic consciousness. So if you want to just go to our last slide here, Danny Cavallero explains that exploring reality means confronting its invisible aspects, seething phantoms which are deliberately excluded from view because they're too debilitating or painful to register. So I think as we're thinking through these hauntings, that's something interesting that we can kind of go back and even circle back to what John mentioned earlier about the importance of like community conversation and lore versus what's in the official records. So yeah, what might appear as a ghost story or a curse or even local lore has the power to sort of expose how memory and knowledge are shaped by our haunted past.
Oh, that's me. So my research was on Elmwood Cemetery, but I'm going to tell you first a little bit about how I got to that point. So I'm a member of Fort Street Presbyterian Church, which I'll tell you a little bit about and why it matters. It was founded in 1849, and it was constructed by the Jordan brothers, who were Gothic revivalist architectures in Detroit at the time. They built it to have the tallest steeple in downtown, which I believe is still true at 81 meters tall. It contains a historic 1914 Wangerin Weckhardt organ that contains over 3,200 pipes.
Wow.
Its roof span is exceeded in width only, apparently globally, by Westminster Hall in London. And it was visited by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1902. There is a plaque on the pew where he sat commemorating that. And part of my membership as an ordained elder in the church was to develop a database of information about its history, because it stretches back obviously through the early 1800s. And most of the founding members of the church were also founding members of the US Republican Party. The first convention was held in Jackson, Michigan in 1854, which is only 5 years after the church itself was established. In finding out a lot of that, I also found out that many of those founding members were interred at Elmwood Cemetery. And so I wanted to go there to learn a little bit more about how their money spoke in the city of Detroit historically, and maybe something about the socioeconomics of Detroit writ large, but also Elmwood Cemetery specifically. And part of my interest in that is my approach to Gothic consciousness is very much based on the boundaries between dichotomies. And we've heard a lot about the boundaries between life and death, past and present. But I was also interested in the boundaries of socioeconomics and geopolitics in Detroit. So if you would go to the next slide, please. That's the exterior of my church. And you can see a similarity to this is the gatehouse of Elmwood Cemetery. I found out that the architects of the gatehouse and the limestone chapel on Elmwood Cemetery property were the Jordan brothers who constructed my church. Elmwood Cemetery was established in 1846, which was only 3 years before the founding of Fort Street Presbyterian Church. It was purchased, 42 acres were purchased for about $1,800. Much of that money came from some of those founding members. It was encompassing the area around Parents Creek, which was part of a privately owned farm in what was then Hamtramck. And that creek is significant because it was the site of what is now known as the Battle of Bloody Run, which in 1763 was part of Pontiac's war against the British fort in Detroit and Fort Wayne. The Native Americans were warned about the British attempting to break the siege on the fort, probably by French intelligence, and they slaughtered the British in Bloody Creek. So it became known as Bloody Creek because as the story goes, the river ran red with the blood of the British. So with that kind of rich history, I was very excited to dive into the history of Elmwood and learn a little bit more. In 1890, Frederick Law Olmsted designed the park layout, and over the following century, it expanded to about 86 acres, which is how large it is today. It also has annexed two neighboring cemeteries, one Catholic and one Jewish, even though Elmwood itself was meant to be a non-denominational space. It was meant to be a rural park in as much as it was a cemetery that was different from some of the crowded church graveyards in the area. Would you go to the next slide, please? So as you can see, it's still very beautiful, and there are bridges and pathways that kind of meander through the constructed hills of the space. Would you hit the next slide, please? Some of my history came both from official records and from unofficial records. So these are some of the official records that I located. And would you hit the next slide? And then I discovered unofficial ones in my church. A woman named Annie Graves Adams, whose grave is on the far right of the screen there with the kind of creepy little cherubim. She actually wrote the first history of my church and of those early Republican Party founding members. So I was very grateful to her basically diary entries that she ended up unofficially publishing in the mid-1800s. You can also see to the left of that, the large mausoleum is the Alger Mausoleum, who contains several people, including an opera singer. But the wife of the Alger patriarch was the one who fronted the money for the church to purchase that large organ that currently sits in its sanctuary. There are also two other tombs that I have here on the left. One is from Samuel Zugg. Zugg was the chair of the Republican Party in its early years, and may have encouraged or inspired John Brown in his raid. The one below that is from James Joy. Joy provided an endowment that for over a century has allowed my historic church to continue running, which is pretty amazing, without any other information. Would you hit the next slide, please? And these are a whole bunch of other tombs that we're not going to talk all about, but there are lots of notable people in the cemetery, including the Chandlers, which is the large sort of ziggurat on the top left. He was a Detroit mayor for some time. He was also a U.S. senator from Michigan for some time. He was obviously an abolitionist, as all of those early Republicans were. And he was a vocal critic of then President Lincoln, saying that he didn't go far enough in his abolition efforts. He was a mover and a shaker, and he was one of the main reasons that the sort of club of rich white abolitionists at Fort Street also founded the Republican Party. Basically, if you wanted to be politically active in Southeast Michigan at the time in support of the Underground Railroad and those early Republican movements, you had to go to Fort Street to hobnob with these people. There was also Hiram Walker, who donated the baptismal font of my church. His 2 children died of diphtheria, and their names are engraved on the Gothic baptismal font. And there was also Eber Ward, who was Detroit's first publicly recognized millionaire. And he owned a steamboat and would ride up and down the riverfront in summer to play music for the people on the shore. So some really cool histories there. Nothing too spooky, right? Would you go to the next slide, please? Then I discovered some of the hauntings. I sort of assumed that with the Battle of Bloody Run, there would be a lot more, and there are some notable ones. I'm going to focus on the one on the left. That is the story of Nathaniel Hickok. His grave was relocated from the Russell Street Cemetery in Eastern Market to Elmwood when Eastern Market was repaved as the market we know it to be today. In 1832, Nathaniel Hickok died of cholera in Detroit during I think the first outbreak of cholera in Detroit. And you can't really see it too well in the picture, but his tombstone reads, "Good friend, for Jesu's sake, forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be he who saves this stone, and cursed be he who moves my bones." With that sort of ominous quote, as this legend of his grave goes, to move the grave, they hired an illiterate gravedigger and bribed him with whiskey to do a solo job, so that he would not know that he was cursed. So I thought that was clever. I found out later that that is the exact same engravement on Shakespeare's gravestone, and that Nathaniel Hickok was most likely an actor at the time, honoring Shakespeare with his tombstone. What else do I want to say about this? I have my notes all over the place. I suppose to sort of round out, I thought I would lean more into the actual ghost stories of Elmwood, but in keeping with my interest in Gothic boundaries as a site of friction, as a blurring of those boundaries, or even violation of those boundaries, I got more interested in the actual historical violations of boundaries, specifically with socioeconomics and with the geography of Elmwood itself. So the 2 things that I would like to share with all of you today are actually not ghost stories. The first is from 1922, and it involves the Gianola Gang, which was part of the Italian quarter of Detroit in the 20s. The Gianola Gang was led by 2 brothers who were called by the Detroit Free Press in some of my research, feudist slayers. They were known for murdering some of their competitors and some people who had slighted them. And they were known to drive very quickly around the Elmwood property, which is not too far from Eastern Market. And they would, as the newspaper said, hurl corpses from speeding cars onto the corner of Elmwood property at Clinton Street. That corner became known as Double Cross Corner, both in honor of the Italian mobsters who would hurl bodies onto the cemetery property, and also because of the St. Mary's Cathedral, which has 2 crosses that kind of overlooks the area, especially if you're looking from downtown. The other story that I want to share with you is from 1928, when a timber wolf was located in Elmwood Cemetery. This interested me as a sort of violation of the boundary between nature and what Elmwood was meant to be as a sort of park, a rural park for the urbanites, wealthy urbanites, and the sort of violent intrusion of nature on the space. So the timber wolf was seen exactly a week before Thanksgiving in 1922, entering the park. There had been rumors that there were wolves literally haunting the park prior to that, like over the course of the summer. A local garage owner saw the wolf, called a local off-duty detective from nearby, he and his partner came to the cemetery and shot and killed that wolf. This was before timber wolves were declared endangered by the state of Michigan. So it's hard to know exactly how common they were in Southeast Michigan, although we know that they were primarily based up north in the UP. But it was interesting that that kind of violation between history, reality, nature, and urbanity sort of combined in this really violent moment that just got a little blurb on the front page of the Detroit Free Press the week before Thanksgiving. I think I will leave some of the more ghost stories to our next presenter, Abby.
Thank you. That is a great setup. I'm also talking about Elmwood Cemetery. I did not know much about Elmwood before I started this. I was attracted by the architecture. In keeping with like the idea of the Gothic, I liked how Elmwood looked. If you want to go to the next, actually go to the next slide. Yes, we'll start there. So like any Gen Z person, I just typed into my computer Elmwood Cemetery and then haunted after it to try and figure out what people were saying about it. And the thing about Elmwood Cemetery is even though it is the longest continuous running non-denominational cemetery in Detroit, and it has all this history, there's actually not a lot of ghost stories associated with it, and the ones that are associated with it, there might be a couple accounts of it, but not really that many. When people think of like haunted Detroit, it's probably not the first place that comes up even. However, there is one notable one that permeates throughout a couple of different archives and records, and seems to be the one that like has most latched on online, which is that of, can you go back? Thank you. Of Elmwood's Veiled Lady. So on Micah's last slide, there was this photo of the same grave, and this is the grave of Eliza Waterman. She is the most notable and like notorious ghost in Elmwood Cemetery, and she is the kind of veiled lady archetype, or the lady in white ghost archetype, where she is seen as very like with these flowing robes, these ghostly a ghostly apparition that like it takes into the fact that she's like so like flowy and like shrouded in a bunch of fabric, and the sculpture above her grave also plays a major part in how she is seen. There's the common story with her is if you touch her grave, then she will follow you home. So this is what interested me as I was doing my research, because I wanted to figure out, where does this come from? And out of all the graves in Elmwood Cemetery, why did this one get so much attention out of all of them? Because Eliza Waterman, unfortunately, not much is known about her. She's not one of the historical figures that like made Detroit or had a huge impact on its history as the archives are available. So again, I wanted to know like why she was so special. So I started digging into that. She died in 1865. So this was after Elmwood had started, but before it was like the park it is today. In 1890, Micah mentioned that Frederick Olmsted, he had a hand in designing the park, or in designing the cemetery to be a park, and he laid out a 125-year plan on how to keep it as a beautiful rural cemetery with a lot of landscape architectural intrigue. So this was even before that when she died, and her husband her husband was Joshua Waterman, and he's the one who paid for the sculpture to be made. It was made by Randolph Rogers, who's a sculptor out of Ann Arbor, who then had success in Europe. And this sculpture back in the day cost $10,000, and now is worth about $275,000. So it was a big, ornament, a big thing, and it was not like the style of the park yet necessarily to have these big ornamental statues. It also has its own lore and bizarre backstory where it fell off, or the ship that it was carrying it from Europe to Detroit sank, and the stone was lost for a long time, eventually recovered and put up at her grave, and then in 1919 there was a huge storm and it actually fell over and broke, and you can still see like the place where it's chipped and scarred on the side of it if you go see it in person. But that's still, again, not really the main thing about her, why she haunts the place, or how the story goes with her. So what the myth around this grave is that she is a vengeful ghost. She's angry because her husband later moved on and married her sister, which is true. This is true. Joshua Waterman did marry Eliza's sister after Eliza passed. And so the story is that she is vengeful and she's seeking, she's, disturbed in the afterlife, and that's why she can't go to rest. What interested me though is that this story probably is not like the most rare in the cemetery. Out of all the hundreds of thousands of people that are buried there, it's not the most absurd thing to be found there. So I really dove into the architecture of this grave and started to think about like, why is this one so fascinating to people? This photo doesn't show it. It's actually quite a thin grave. It really is. It's quite tall but quite thin, so it does stand out in that way. And unlike some of like the mausoleums of Elmwood Cemetery, it's not tucked into a hill or anything. It's just kind of out there in the open. So it was very fascinating to me, like how it is both very ornamental, it's both very decorative, and also it kind of stands out. It's kind of not exactly the ornamental that Elmwood is proposed to have. So this really fascinated me. And I started thinking about Elmwood as a park and Elmwood as, right now it's an arboretum, so it has 91 different species of trees, and this is something that they pride themselves on, and you can take a tree tour, and there's different plaques on all the trees. So there is a nature aspect to the cemetery and to visiting the cemetery that they pride themselves on and that they want to highlight. And when I went and did my site visit, something that I noticed is that takes a lot of landscape labor. Like there's a lot of people working on the landscape at all times, and this kind of jarred me because it doesn't kind of break the immersion of this being a really quiet resting place, and it's something that I wanted to look into further, or at least consider in terms of talking about a cemetery as a park or as a rural preservation area, is that takes a lot of labor. You can go pass. So while I was doing my archival work, this is the one story that like kind of shocked me and like took me out of like my framework of thinking of this as a historical place and thinking of this as like in a way that would a museum or another cultural institution, is that this is a story from 2018, because Elmwood is continuously operating. It is still a working cemetery. This is a story that was published in it was an up north newspaper, so it was not the Detroit Free Press, it was not a major newspaper, but it was this is a 12-year-old boy, and he was raising money by raking leaves to get a headstone for his friend who passed away from leukemia, who's also 12. And he was raking leaves to do that, and the other boy, he was buried in Elmwood Cemetery, but his family didn't have enough money for a grave marker. So this was kind of in my research process a culmination of everything I was thinking about in terms of like the physical labor of maintaining a landscape, and also how wealth was still defining, and wealth inequality was still defining the landscape of Elmwood Cemetery. As Micah mentioned, there are a lot of businessmen and a lot of Michigan's like earliest tycoons and like movers and shakers who are buried there, and those are the ones that contributed to that Gothic feel with the huge mausoleums and the very ornate graves. Joshua Waterman himself was a real estate tycoon. So a lot of the Gothic architecture and the way that Elmwood presents itself now is is tied to that early wealth inequality of like the late 1800s, the early 1920s, when Detroit was having its huge economic boom. So now thinking about Elmwood as it stands today, it does have a marker, or it doesn't have the reputation of carrying on Detroit's history, and it is its tagline, and it something it like prides itself on is like how Detroit's history endures and how Elmwood endures. And when thinking about how this is also a cultural institution as well as a working cemetery, I couldn't help think about the wealth inequality that still persists through there, and then there are these pockets, although not part of the archives necessarily, of that wealth inequality still coming through today. So in addition to looking at like the architecture for its interest, I couldn't help thinking about all of the graves that were not as interesting or that didn't have clear markers. There are a number of unmarked graves that we heard about in Dr. Key's class around Detroit that were either mass graves from cholera or just were never marked. So I left Elmwood Cemetery with this mixed feeling about how the Gothic atmosphere was definitely provided by someone putting a lot of work and money into their historical marker, but also how that was leaving a lot of people out of this physical archive that is one of the few that you can walk around and feel Detroit's history. So that's essentially where my research led me, just to thinking about like how these architectural pieces get remembered as a cemetery, in place sometimes of the people who are buried there. So yeah.
We have 15 minutes left.
Right.
I'm just putting that out there as we jump into the next. Oh,
Those are
or-
some graves.
All right, I'll go quick on this then. So we wanted to kind of think about what would be a good case study for everyone as far as how could we look at a well-known ghost and how that ghost may have how we could explore Detroit's Gothic consciousness through them, right? So Houdini being a popular name, we thought maybe that would be a great place to start because most people or a lot of people know who Houdini is. And if you went on the tour last night, I'm assuming, I was not there, but I'm assuming you went through
Yes.
the funeral home. So, and one of the questions at the end of the course that we took with Dr. Key is we were grouped together and she asked us to think about whether or not our ghost would be friends. And I was partnered with someone who had Houdini, and because I had Benny Evangelista, there's spiritualist and very staunch anti-spiritualist, right? So they would not have been friends. However, it got me thinking about, okay, well, if they're kind of on the same page in that, what does it mean to be a ghost or ghost stories and exploring Detroit's consciousness when they kind of balance each other on the scales, right? Like, how do they haunt Detroit either the same or differently when essentially they're balancing each other out on opposite ends? As I said, some of you may have gone on the walking tour yesterday and gone past the funeral home that held Houdini's body before he was transported back to his wife. And so for those reasons, that's why we're starting with him. You might go into the next slide. So using Jess's awesome outline of what is Detroit's Gothic consciousness, I'm going to walk through a couple of things when it comes to the mythologized origins, the reimagined histories, selective memories, and historical hauntings. The next one. So as far as the mythologized origins, as we know, Houdini died here in Detroit. He died on Halloween in 1926. He died at Grace Hospital, which is no longer standing. And there is thinking of the mythologized origins, there's stories about how did he die. Was it appendicitis that he had been suffering from prior to his last final shows, or was it due to a over-enthusiastic fan who asked to punch him in the stomach a bunch of times and then went for it without him bracing? That happened right before the show that he eventually died after. And so to begin with, we're trying to think of, okay, how are these origins, what's real, what's not real, right? And like, how are they remembered? Are they remembered in the way that's quote unquote real or remembered in the way that they're not? We can go to the next one. When it comes to reimagined histories, so Houdini performed at the Garrick Theater. However, it's often said that he haunts the Majestic Theater, which is a place that he never had performed. So why is it that it's been transferred over, right? So the Garrick closed in 1928 and was torn down in 1929 for a large drugstore, which funnily enough is known as the Cunningham building, which is my last name, and I just love weird stuff like that. But if the Garrick Theater was torn down, there's still a building there, but it's not the theater. And it's nearby in the city to the Majestic. Is it just that the story wants to stay alive, so it goes to the next place that's similar enough where it can stay alive because that place is still alive? So thinking about how the stories move through the city, how they move through locations, and why, right? The next slide, please. So for selective memory, surprisingly, there are some stories about Houdini haunting the funeral home where his body was kept. And there are some about Grace Hospital, but they're not nearly as well told as the ones about the Majestic. So when we're thinking about selective memory, why is it that, again, the stories that are the most popular are the ones that are at the place where he wasn't there, but also Grace Hospital and the Hamilton Funeral Home. While the Hamilton Funeral Home is still there, it's not operational, and Grace isn't there, right? So our selective memory as a unit of people telling ghost stories are going to find the place where you can still go visit and still see it and still get spooked out, right? But he was at the funeral home until he was able to be shipped back to his wife in New York, and he was put in his show coffin at the time, right, which was not made for actually transporting bodies. So the story goes that as his brass coffin with the glass top made its way to New York, it broke to a certain degree and then was lost in transit for an amount of time. If you can go to the next one. So when it comes to the historical haunting, this year is the 100th anniversary of Houdini's death on Halloween. So if we're looking at how he may have played a role in Detroit's Gothic consciousness up until now, and how might he after 100 years of hauntings, right? So they've done official seances every year, which began with Houdini's wife, Bess, because they had made a pact with one another. Even though he was staunchly anti-spiritualist, they wanted to see if what was real, right? So they made a pact that whichever one passed away first, that person would try to contact the other one. And Bess kept that going until 1936, but the world has kept it going until now, right? It's still going. So there are multiple, if you go online and just search up seances for 100th anniversary, they're all happening all over the world. One is being planned for the site of Grace Hospital, since that is the place where he actually passed away. And if we're thinking about how these things have inundated the Detroit's Gothic consciousness, what would happen as we continue to move forward? I'll say the fun fact is that about the casket that used to hold Houdini, it has been suggested that though it was lost in transit, it had since been found and been kept from Houdini's estate so that it can stay here in Detroit. And after its 100 years are up, they would be able to display it. So let's say we get that casket. Let's say it shows up in Detroit on the 100th anniversary. What does that do for Detroit's Gothic consciousness as well, and for the story of Houdini? So just because he's more of a well-known person, we felt like that might be a really good place as a case study for everybody to kind of start thinking about Detroit's Gothic consciousness, whether it's through Houdini or whether it's through someone else. So yeah.
Let's see.
Was that fast enough?
Yeah, that was
You did great.
because we have 8 minutes left, and I think maybe explaining a little bit and then teasing, like, so I don't know if you had this or did anyone. Okay, I will. So one of the things we were hoping, I'm going to be doing a session later this afternoon on claiming Detroit's lost ghost, which is an offshoot of this. But in thinking about that kind of Houdini kind of case study was like the process of thinking through ghost stories and telling ghost stories, not only of Detroit, but you can think of any region or city or place that you might be familiar with, and the ways in which these mythologies grow. We used Houdini because, like, again, it's the 100th anniversary. We heard the story on our ghost tour in my class. And it's really near, the funeral home is right down the street from from campus. But are there people or places that you're familiar with, either in Detroit or elsewhere, that seem ripe for crafting a kind of Gothic consciousness or a ghost story, or revisiting histories or challenging histories? And so for the people in person, we've passed out some things. If you want to like write ideas down, or maybe you've already sketched drawings on them or whatever, make them into paper airplanes if you feel like it. But again, later this afternoon, we're going to be doing some work of actually kind of crafting some ghost stories, both based in Detroit, and for people that aren't in Detroit or aren't as familiar with it, kind of the places with which you're familiar. But I wanted to be sure to open this up for questions too. Give people time, or if they had anything they wanted to ask us. Oh, yeah.
I have a couple of fun questions.
Okay.
So for Micah and Abby, when you went to Elmwood, did either of you touch the veiled lady? See if she followed you.
Yes.
Did you see the veiled lady?
Did not.
That's right.
I know.
The other one, and this is, I guess, regarding the Houdini thing, is I noticed last time I was downtown the new Museum of Illusions with Houdini's face. What are the chances that the coffin magically appears?
Yeah. I think it would be pretty cool.
Which might be a bit of a curveball, and I'm sorry if it is. I'm just really interested in the idea of Gothic as a way of thinking, and sort of also a way of teaching and sharing information, and maybe as a kind of pedagogy. And I just wonder, from the perspective of like an educator and people who are kind of attending the class as an educator, what do you kind of think that this experience has kind of said about how the Gothic can be applied to that kind of teaching and communal space of education?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I said something to this effect yesterday, but in the roundtable. But I think, if nothing else, this class, because I will say, when I first started this class, it was, I love ghosts and haunting. I want to watch scary movies and scary video games and read, Haunting of Hill House, because who doesn't? But then it was also, but yeah, we're also in Detroit, and I feel like, there are these famous places in Detroit that are supposedly haunted, Eloise Asylum, the Whitney, and I was like, oh, we should do something with that. There's got to be something there. And I feel like getting more into kind of a Gothic way of thinking impressed upon me the need to think about the places I inhabit, whether that be through work or teaching or fun or where I live, and the histories, both the ones I know and the ones I don't know, because I feel like, if nothing else, this class really impressed upon me the histories I don't know about the place I exist. And some of that is, I didn't grow up here, I'm a transplant, but it's made me much more mindful in my life, but also I think in my teaching, of how can we connect to this place, like really place-based stuff. And I feel like that's something John and Andy were both getting at too, is that need to kind of connect with a space, either through culturally or through, actually going there and things like that. Yeah. But I don't know.
I was going to jump off of that a little bit as well, because that's something that, I grew up in Metro Detroit, but like being here, you hear a lot of horror stories from people who do not visit Detroit and do not know Detroit and have fear of Detroit, right? And how does the Gothic consciousness kind of run into that as well, right? It like, do the stories about Detroit, especially the violent ones, or even the things that we're seeing in the movies, like things like The Crow and all of these things that present Detroit in this kind of violent way, but also Gothic conscious way, are those stories keeping the world view of Detroit in the same way that it is? And is that affecting tourism in Detroit? And is that, like, I'm thinking about what we're seeing right now with the World Cup and all these people coming into these different places of America that they didn't know anything about, and they're actually really enjoying themselves. And I'm like, could that be Detroit? Especially if these stories, I mean, these stories are a lot of fun, but they're also, I think, to some degree, they could be limiting as far as keeping alive these ideas of this place as well. So that was kind of something I've been thinking about a lot from the class. Yeah.
There's also, I think, an aspect for the researchers part. It sort of democratizes the research process by allowing us to not just research the official records and the sort of institutionalized history, but to find the cool things that are word of mouth and the local legends, things on obscure internet chat rooms, right? Because those add to the myth of the place where we call home in a way that you wouldn't know if you looked in a history book, right? Or on the Wikipedia page of a place, right? And so it sort of allows us to empathize with our research sources rather than just verifying them.
Yeah.
You know?
I think kind of jumping off that, it also, when we started out doing this research, it kind of blew my mind because if we weren't able to find like verifiable, information, it wasn't the kind of research that we were used to doing. And I think a lot of us were like, how do we pivot here? Where do we go from here? I can't prove that, and that was an interesting practice and engagement also, just in like shifting the way we like approached this process. It was like completely different than anything, at least for me, that I've ever done, which was a challenge in a really good way. And it really kind of got my mind thinking in a different way and, approaching our research with this Gothic consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just echo that. I think it made me think more creatively about how to research and also like what the point of that research was. Like what am I trying to find here, especially when it's something like a ghost, where even if you found a bunch of articles that said it happened, like there's still an element of like unprovable nature that is inherent to ghosts and hauntings. So it really made me question like, what am I trying to get out of this research?
I love that.
Yeah.
'Cause I will say, like, as the longer I've been in my career, the more I've tried, and I actively work at trying to be comfortable with gaps and fractures and incompleteness and embracing it. Because I think as young graduate students and researchers, we're taught to verify your sources, and you got to have the backup, and you got to have the foot. And there are things that don't have an archive. And you kind of have to be willing to work with that and work in that. Yeah.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And the humanities, as we know, are not empirical.
Yeah.
It's about what we feel and what we kind of know instinctively.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really helpful.
Yeah. Well, we are at 12:30. So we are now going to take a break for lunch for those of us that are in Detroit. For those of you that are online, if you come back, we'll be coming back on another Zoom link. It's the second Zoom link for today. But yes, otherwise we will see you in just about an hour. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.